The story starts off in a virtual world where people plundered and slaughtered themselves as if they were in a casual game of GTA. The leader of a renowned guild famously known as the Knights of Glory, Master Devea, had just received intel from one of her spies that a deadly assassin known as Rate was on the loose. One of the members of the guild remarked by saying it was a normal thing to release an assassin right before a siege. Devea replied by saying that this particular assassin was extremely overpowered, and they would have to go all out if they were to stand a chance against him. Just then, Master Devea noticed a flock of birds flying toward them all, so she ordered the rest of the guild members to shoot them down. However, the guild members thought it was bullshit, and a total waste of their time to be attacking the birds like that. However, these were not ordinary birds, they were mechanical birds that were being controlled by Rate. The birds had taken enough and launched their own attack on the guild. Then there was a massive explosion, and Master Devea had terrible luck, so she was the only one who suffered a deadly blow. She was seen lying on the ground with skin looking like a well-cooked steak, actually a bit overcooked. While her colleagues were screaming her name in mourning, she pulled the Jesus card and immediately got resurrected with magical rings surrounding her head and torso. She mentioned that it was all thanks to the sacrificial magic tool that she wore around her neck. This item was known for substituting the wearer if they were to take on any critical damage. It was also powerful enough to make a person evade death, which was a rare feat. Apparently, this whole occurrence was Rate's doing, and it made the other guild members realize just how dangerous he was. She also mentioned that sacrificial magic tools had some restrictions before they would activate again, so they shouldn't let their guard down as they had done before. Moments later, Devea noticed something strange on the ground, but before she knew it, she had been engulfed in flames as a result of yet another explosion. She was down on the ground when suddenly, a pillar fell out of place and onto her frail and pathetic body, and with her last breath, she began to ponder how it was even possible for there to have been explosives in the building. She also wondered whether this entire situation had been planned by Rate, and the explosives may have been placed ever since they had constructed the building. Moments later, we see another one of Rate's bird minions fly around the area under his control in his headquarters to inform Devea that what had exploded was no ordinary explosion. Rather, it was a magic power injection device. Just then, his minion notified him that he had gotten new mail which was to congratulate him on completing his mission, so he received a piece of gold as his reward. Rate explained that normally, the maximum depth from which an explosive could affect a person on the surface of the earth was 5 meters. Anything below that wouldn't have any effect because the explosion would be absorbed into the ground. However, this would only be true if it were only regular explosives used. What Rate had made use of was a magic power injection device, which when injected with a significant amount of magic power, would explode even on the slightest provocation. He went on to mention that despite how solid your assassination technique was, there would always be people who come out to counter it. But that shit didn't matter to him because no matter how many countermeasures people prepare against him, he would always devise a new assassination method by using his production skill. And to him, this was the way things always were and should be. A production job, which as the name implied, was a job that produced all sorts of things. However, our guy was a jobless dumbass in real life, so he decided to do the next best thing, which was to become an assassin in a VR MMO game because his life in the real world was so depressing. The name of this game was Virtual Life Online, or VLO for short, where death was regarded as a big deal because a player who died would have their level reduced by 1, and to add to that, the player would be prevented from logging in for 3 good days. For high-level players, reducing their level would already be equivalent to reducing 100 hours of their gameplay efforts to a can of chopped liver. But the game devs were a bunch of heartless monsters, so they decided to create an even heavier penalty, which was simply the inability to log in. For instance, if there were to be a fight between guilds for territory, if the main force of a guild was dead and also unable to log in for the guild war, the fate of that guild is destined to be defeat. Several guilds had their main force to be dead at the worst timing, which further resulted in their guild getting smoked. However, it was a rare occurrence for players in VLO to die, and in the worst case, you would be knocked unconscious and have to be revived in the town. Only a few big bosses, as well as a handful of other players, were able to successfully kill players, so if you got killed way too often, just like any MMO game, you're assumed to be trash. Whenever there was a battle between top guilds, each guild would employ dozens of assassins for their own support, so to witness a fight scene between 2 or more assassins wouldn't be a rare feat. Concerning assassins, Rate himself was considered to be an exceptional snowflake by everyone, unlike his family did. He wasn't the average assassin who had boring archery skills or dual blade skills. He was a production job who used poisons and explosives to take out his enemies. It was obvious to him that he would lose in head-on combat. However, he didn't need to engage in such acts because, unlike regular combat, his method of assassination had absolutely no countermeasure. To make this clearer, if it were an assassination against a highly ranked guild, the assassin would be considered to be excellent if they had a slaughter rate, a success rate of 15% or higher. However, Rate's assassination success rate was higher than 99.9%, and if my math is right, this means that it would be very rare for him to be unsuccessful. Apparently, Rate had taken on more than 1,000 assassination missions and had only ever failed one. He believed that his success rate was the highest among all assassins in VLO. While Rate was taking a stroll in the city, he suddenly received a mail, but not the kind he was used to. He opened it and read it as a letter from a player called Goddess Mises who was requesting his help. Rate wondered who the heck that was and also immediately thought it was some kind of prank, considering that there were certain restrictions on what a player could name their character. Anything containing the word God or 69 was prohibited, so this made him believe that the letter was some bogus prank, especially since the sender was named Goddess Mises. Rate proceeded to search for Goddess Mises, even though he didn't believe she existed, since would be connected and able to hear her voice if she did exist. To his surprise, the device connected, and he heard her voice loud and clear. He then inquired about how she had been able to use a name containing God in her name and whether the ban had been lifted. Goddess Mises replied, saying that she had that name because she was a real god and was also the one who made the game, so she has admin privileges and could choose whatever name she wished. Even Godslayer 69. Rate didn't believe a word she said about being the creator of the game and thought about how delusional this person must be. Nonetheless, he went along with it and asked for the details of the mission. She explained that it was the assassination of a god who came from another world called Masarazul, and since Rate had all the names of the strong players memorized, he wasn't familiar with this one and immediately concluded that this target would be an easy one, so all he needed was the location. Rate was a man of focus, commitment, and sheer freaking business, so he went on to ask for the reward he would get for this mission, which he requested be gold, so she agreed. She offered to pay him 1,000 tons of pure gold. However, Rate had been broke his entire life, so he didn't believe her when she offered to pay such a large amount. He urged her to be serious about the amount she would be paying him, but she was dead serious about the 1,000 tons of gold, which would be equivalent to 5 million yen. However, she would be paying him fully on the other side of the world. Rate still didn't believe her and wondered when her delusions were going to end. But he then had a sudden change of heart and decided to accept the mission with a smirk on his face. Mises was pleased to hear this, so she thanked him while saying that she would have considered herself dead if he hadn't accepted her request. Rate thought she was being a tad dramatic, seeing that this was all just a game in the first place. But on the contrary, she said this wasn't just an ordinary game. Just then, Rate noticed a teleportation stone which was then activated. But this was strange since teleportation stones never activate on their own. As Rate was being covered by some magic teleportation substance, Mises mentioned that she didn't have an opportunity to explain what was going on, so she would just send him the objective. In the heat of the moment, he asked for prep time since he was terrible at hand-to-hand combat, and he would also need information about the target so he could whip up a countermeasure for him. But she told him that he wouldn't be able to bring foreign items along with him, which was his entire thing. This would render him powerless since he couldn't bring any of his poisons and explosives with him. She also mentioned that the teleportation stone was going to transport him to another world, which Rate didn't understand at all. Goddess Mises felt that Rate was the best fit for the job as his skill and knowledge would definitely be useful in the other world. His target was the evil god Masarazul, the only other god present in that world. Rate had gotten himself into an ice sky where he spawned in a grass field with his palm on the ground and wondered where the heck he was. He observed a green forest filled with plants and animals, so he decided to make use of his GPS to figure out his location. But as he opened his item box, to his surprise, it was empty. It turned out that the goddess wasn't spitting straight facts when she said he couldn't bring any foreign items there with him. So he proceeded to wander the strange forest, which looked similar to VLO, but the quality appeared to be too high to be a game scenery. It was more akin to something one would find in real life. He was slowly starting to believe the goddess's words that he had been transported to another world. And just then, he heard the goddess's voice through the device that he had used to call her. She was apologizing for bringing him to the wrong destination because she wasn't strong enough. The population of her believers had reduced drastically, so she wasn't able to use her power to its full capacity. Rate was still baffled and didn't understand what she was referring to, so she explained that the source of God's power was the faith of their believers. If they were to lose all their believers, it would make them lose their power as a god and eventually disappear. And after they disappear, all memory of them as a god would be gone from the world. Rate realized being a god was no easy task, and she further added that all the other gods had been annihilated by the evil god Master Azul. Rate's last 2 brain cells finally clicked, and he finally realized what was going on. He had been summoned by a goddess in her last moments to assassinate her opposing god. Rate then asked an obvious question, which was whether all other gods apart from her and Master Azul had disappeared, which goddess Mises confirmed. She also added that Master Azul had several disciples, which were solely to reduce the population of the believers of other gods. His disciples even went as far as killing other gods' believers or torturing them until they changed who they worshipped. Suddenly, the goddess's hologram began to fade because she hadn't paid for the unlimited plan and was out of energy to keep it going. Rate begged her not to leave him in that spooky forest, but she apologized through incomplete sentences due to the poor connection. Her last words were that when her power returned, she would definitely give him his reward. Rate realized that he had been tossed into the wilderness like yesterday's garbage and was now stuck with doing this on his own. However, he didn't regret accepting the request because he found this one to be quite interesting. He made the decision that he would have to take care of his safety first before he began the assassination operation. So he wandered around the forest but couldn't find any traces of human life. He had learned earlier that he couldn't bring foreign materials to this world. However, that didn't mean he was unable to use his basic VLO skills. So he made use of his search enemy skill and was able to detect multiple monsters in the forest who he considered a middle-level threat to him. He then concluded that this forest was not a safe place. He used magic to spawn some pure water and realized that if he could use magic, he would be able to use his production skill too, which would make him live life in easy mode. Rate realized that he had better hurry and gather supplies or else he was going to be lunch for the monsters. So firstly, he needed to find some metal, and he explored the forest until he discovered some bauxite. However, this wasn't Minecraft, so he needed to extract and prepare the weapon manually. He placed 2 fingers on the bauxite and began to use his extraction skill to get pure aluminum weighing about 500 grams, which he then used his metamorphosis skill on to craft a needle from the aluminum he had gathered. This needle dealt very little damage, however, he found a way to compensate for its weakness. He bent over to pluck a poisonous plant called a death root from the ground, ground its root, and smeared its sap on the point of the needle, thereby creating an impromptu weapon. Although it wouldn't be that effective against high-ranking monsters, he attempted to open his item box and check its status, but his system ignored him, and since the status screen didn't show, it meant that his environment was entirely different from the VLO game. Not only that, but he didn't have any items, so there was no way for him to accurately measure his strength in this new world. The only way he could gauge his strength a bit was by using skills, so he made use of his martial arts crush kick technique to obliterate a tree trunk. Surely, this was a proper evaluation of his strength as he realized that he could activate his offensive skills which were just as powerful as expected. He also assumed that he had the same stats as in VLO. As night drew closer, he decided that it was time to build a house which he would be able to live in. So he made use of his metamorphosis skill once more to craft an aluminum saw which he used to cut the trees into logs of wood that he later stacked in the shape of a triangle. He somehow managed to use his spaghetti arms to dig the foundation of the house. Now it was time to actually start the building. However, he didn't build it the boring manual way, but with the aid of his magic, he was able to assemble and build his house in a matter of minutes. After he was done, he stepped into the house to get a whiff of that new house smell. When he realized that it was a little too big for a single person to live in, it was big enough to throw a massive house party. However, he lacked one of the major requirements, friends. Later, he decided that he needed to scavenge some food and more importantly, some mana stones. He wished to make some artifacts, which were items that use mana stones as a source of power to activate multiple spells. However, essential mana stones could only be found inside the body of a monster, which meant they would have to be removed manually, and therefore he decided it was time to do some hunting. The aluminum that he had collected wasn't enough to craft a proper melee weapon, and the poison needle would contaminate the meat of the prey, so he decided to make use of a log of wood, paired with his metamorphosis technique to craft a wooden bow. The next material on the list was the bowstring, but manufacturing it wasn't a fool's task. He proceeded to extract some fiber from a plant stem, and while the elastic properties were still active, he would knit it into a thread, and subsequently, he would braid the single threads together to make it even stronger. After a whole production process, the bow had finally been crafted. He also made some arrows with the leftover aluminum he had, and with all these factors in place, he was ready to hunt. He stepped into the forest and used his search enemy technique to discover that his nearest enemy was at 2 o'clock. So he climbed a tree branch and took an archer pose so sleek that the green arrow had nothing on him. He observed a big frog seated on a rock and immediately wondered whether it was edible. He let off a shot from his bow which was on target and pierced the side of the frog. However, the arrow didn't have enough power to kill it. The frog was pissed off and noticed where the shot had come from, so he leaped rapidly towards the tree which Rate had mounted himself and jumped really high to the branch Rate was on. And on reaching there, Rate had disappeared, basically saying a EU row not this time homie EUR. Rate appeared to be under the frog at a very pleasing angle, where he would land a devastating shot on the ugly frog. Upon all the arrows piercing its body, the frog was still down to throw some hands. As it shot its disgusting tongue at Rate, he simultaneously let off a single calculated shot aimed at its uvula. Just as it hit, he remarked, saying that when shooting one wasn't enough, it just meant you need to shoot some more. He had completed his mission, so he later went back to his house and wondered what he was going to do with the frog's meat he had acquired. Obviously, he was going to cook it. After he was done with the cooking, he mentioned that it somehow tasted like chicken. But I think the wilderness was just driving him crazy. Since he had such a fancy meal to eat, his survival had now bumped up to hyper very easy mode. However, this meat wasn't the kind one could just stuff their face with. Since it was a frog monster, it contained about 10 poison sacs which Rate was careful enough not to break, or else it would have contaminated all the meat. At last, he had obtained the mana stone, and considering the strength of the frog monster, the mana stone would equally be as strong, and therefore it would be very useful to him. So far, he had gotten food, a mana stone, and defeated a monster, and now his final goal was to kill the evil god Master Azul, although his evil nature wasn't confirmed, and he also wasn't sure whether he could even trust Goddess Mises in the first place. However, that shit didn't matter to him because he had already accepted the contract with her, and it was his duty to kill his target, period. A few moments later, he decided to create some artifacts with the mana stones he had collected earlier from the ugly frog monster. Rate sat down and decided that he was going to make an artifact that could detect magic. However, he had a very faint memory about the procedure on how to manufacture them. Simultaneously, the materials he possessed were a bit lacking, but still decided to give it a shot. He used his metamorphosis technique to craft a magic hammer-looking tool which would be used to imbue magic. He proceeded to strike the surface of a metal with the magic tool, and just like that, the manufacturing of the artifact had begun. The artifact he was building would be used to detect magic power that's used to cast spells. Both animals and monsters could possess magic power. However, only humans could use it, which meant that the artifact would only activate if there was a nearby human currently using magic. After he had hammered away for a while, a spike had been formed at the end of the initially rectangle metal plate, which would act as an antenna to increase its sensitivity. It was no exaggeration to say that the quality of magic detectors like that are entirely dependent on the strength of the mana stones and spikes used in building them, which is why the spike wasn't built using Rate's metamorphosis skill, but was rather imbued with magic and slowly molded while being enchanted. Put in simple terms, metamorphic magic was shit compared to forging and imbuing. After a while, the spike had become saturated with magic and had reached its limit. This was the furthest Rate could go with this material, so he decided that it was done. Next, he uttered the magic words bind and bestow, which marked the completion of the building of the magic detector. He trusted that it would be able to pick up anything within a 1 kilometer radius, but still put it to the test by using his magic to fill a cup with pure water. The device immediately detected it, which indicated that it was functioning properly. He sipped his water in success of his new device when shortly after, his stomach rumbled as a result of his dire hunger, so he knew it was time to get some dinner. We see him taking the frog meat which he had obtained earlier, and putting them in skewers and placing them around firewood, intending to roast them. Rate sat down near the firewood and attempted to use his forge fire technique to ignite a fire. However, he had busted his ass while casting spells and his mana was depleted, so he decided to ration his magic and use the bare minimum. Moments later, the fire was lit, and the meat began to cook under the intense heat. He was about to take them off the fire to eat, but decided to leave them for a little longer. Subsequently, he hoped that it didn't give him diarrhea because he hadn't built a bathroom yet, and also didn't want to make a mess in his pants. Just then, his 2 brain cells had clicked, and he had stumbled upon a brilliant idea. He decided to treat himself to a little luxury by seasoning the meat with some salt. After the meat was done cooking and was well salted, seasoned, he blew on it and then sunk his teeth into it. He marveled at how just mere salt made such a difference in deliciousness. He assumed that frog meat would be very plain. However, it appeared to have an unexpected greasy consistency. After his meal, he had all that leftover meat and wondered what he was going to do with it. He wished to store it somehow, but he'd need mana stones to build a fridge or freezer, and the only way he could get them was by fighting a monster. However, he wasn't really in the mood for that shit, so he thought about storing it in his item box but feared it would rot. He was a dumbass, so he still kept it there despite his second thoughts, and if it ended up getting rotten, he would just deal with it when the time came. He didn't have a mattress yet, so he laid down on the wooden floor. He then realized that it was about time to start searching for people, but he wasn't sure whether the inhabitants of this world were friendly because a random person who he encountered could begin to attack him just at the sight of his ugly face. So he knew he couldn't go out without proper preparations. Meanwhile, he decided to focus mainly on the preparation of magic potions. Yesterday, he had fought without any potions, and that gruesome encounter was one which he didn't want to experience again. The next morning, he stepped out of his house with a crooked back. This was because he had slept without a mattress or futon and his body was hurting like hell. He then defined his new task to be to get a mattress. After walking through the forest for a while, he stumbled upon the herb he would be using to prepare the potion, which coincidentally grew so near to his house. It was a common plant known as Mia's herb. Among all the medical plants, it stood close to the lowest rank. However, when enchanted and mixed, it could be used to make level 2 potions. He harvested Mia's herb from every single place he could find it, and when he had collected enough, he took them back to his house and began the preparation process. Firstly, he mashed the herbs while pouring some magic in, and then mixed the sap with water and put it all on a stove to boil. He awkwardly waited for it to boil, and after a while, it was done and a level 2 potion had been conjured. He was pleased that it was this easy to make low-level potions. The potions which high-level players used to make in VLO were level 11 potions, and level 2 potions were dog shit compared to them because they were about 500 times weaker. However, his inferior level 2 potions were still indeed better than nothing at all, but if it were possible, he would like to prepare at least a few level 4 potions. But he decided to worry about that later. Rate realized that he had fucked up by not making any flasks to store the potions, so he made use of his metamorphosis technique to quickly whip up a few containers for the potions. He then filled the flasks and managed to get 5 full bottles, which would help him greatly on the battlefield. After he was done, he stepped out and decided he was going to scout the area and hunt for some monsters so he could obtain mana stones, which he would use to create more artifacts. He used his search enemy technique to scan the area for any nearby enemies, and proceeded to kick each and every monster ass which crossed his path, and obtained a boatload of mana stones with which he could build several useful artifacts. The first artifacts he decided to build were flashbangs, so started off by making use of his magic to crush a mana stone. This felt like a waste to him, but flashbangs couldn't be made without breaking mana stones, so he was left no choice. He crushed the mana stones until it had become a fine powder called a mana fragment. The next step was to imbue it with magic. However, even if you imbue a mana fragment with magic, the effects would only manifest briefly, as a single fragment would only light up with a dim light for a single moment. Nevertheless, putting hundreds of thousands of fragments together would release a blinding flash. It was obvious that he couldn't use the powder as it was, so he fused them all together using his merge technique into a solid container. Rate didn't feel safe having just one flashbang. He then decided to make 3 just for good measure, so he continued to crush mana stones till the next morning. The following morning, he had finally finished. It apparently took him all night to make those 3 flashbangs, but it was still light work compared to how hard it would be to make high-level items. Suddenly, his magic detector started going crazy, which baffled him because he wasn't using any magic at that time. He made the sudden realization that it meant there was someone nearby using magic. He then grabbed the magic detector along with his bow and sprinted towards the direction which the magic was being sensed. Rate was clueless about what kind of person was using the magic, regardless of whether it was a friend or foe. He had to check it out. It definitely wasn't a friend though. The magic detector then indicated the direction in which the magic was strongest, so Rate followed accordingly while using his stealth support technique to conceal his image. Just then, he heard a voice screaming at full capacity, telling someone to get their ass out of there because it was dangerous. Rate used this person's voice to locate their exact position, and continued to advance in that direction. Rate hid in a tree branch above and observed an ugly bear monster terrorizing a father and his children. Rate then observed a wounded man lying on the ground, and a smoking hot, but terrified teenage girl inquiring about the man's well-being, who didn't look like much of a fighter. But worst of all, even the knight attempting to protect them had a serious flesh wound on his shoulder which was likely to have come in contact with poison. Rate realized that if didn't act quickly, they all would be dead in the next 5 minutes. He decided what to save them, so he gathered a little intelligence. He landed on the scene in a very corny Batman pose. The bear then roared at the sight of how hideous he was. Rate didn't care in the slightest and proceeded to launch attacks on the bear by throwing a flashbang which emitted a blinding light, providing the perfect opportunity to land a deafening blow. He then unleashed the poison needles that he had built earlier, but suddenly realized that the monster was probably a higher rank compared to the ones he had fought earlier, so it wasn't likely that the poison needles alone would be enough to kill him. In that case, he decided to take the monster down by upping the dosage of the poison needle and modifying it to become a poison arrow. He placed his arrow in the bow and pointed it at the bear while telling the girl not to move an inch unless she wanted to finish the job. Rate let off a shot that pierced the bear's back, which provoked it and made it focus all its attention on him. This bear turned into Mike Tyson and began to throw heavy blows at Rate. However, he managed to evade every one of his attacks. Rate had been patient and his plan was about to fall into place. The poison on the arrow was a mixture of 3 different magic enums. The first one was a neurotoxin made from deathroot. It was generally the deadliest among all 3. The second was the hemorrhagic toxin made from some poisonous mushrooms, which was added to the mix in order to reliably kill monsters who were immune to neurotoxins. Just as the bear was about to use Rate as a late lunch, it immediately froze up and stopped its attack, leaving Rate to walk majestically past it Power Rangers style. This was all thanks to the third toxin, which is a paralyzing poison obtained from the venom sac of the monster frog he had killed earlier. This venom paralyzed the target, giving time to the other toxins to take effect. It also inhibits the cerebral activity, which gave the monster a relief of pain, meaning that it won't be aware of its condition until a few moments before its death, so that it won't struggle in vain since its death would be inevitable. After the victim's eyes had recovered from the light of the flashbang, they were surprised to see the bear down on the ground with a skinny, mysterious stranger standing victorious, asking themselves, who exactly is this bastard? The wounded soldier then asked Rate whether he was the one who had killed the bear. He replied saying that he was the one responsible. He mentioned that since the wounded man lying on the floor could still move around freely, the bear's poison was most likely a slow one. However, the bear had cut deeply through his chest, and by the looks of it, he was going to die of blood loss way before the poison got to his heart and killed him. He walked towards the wounded man to render some assistance by patching him up, but the soldier stopped him, saying even though he had saved them, he couldn't allow him to go any further. Rate mentioned that he didn't give a shit that they had stopped him and reminded them that the injured man on the ground was going to die if they didn't take any action, all while calling the injured man an old fart. The soldier took offense to Rate's words and told him that the injured man was a very important person. Rate replied saying that since he was so important, it would be much worse if he let him die. The soldier understood Rate's logic and realized that he didn't have a choice but to accept this stranger's help. The soldier finally accepted Rate's help. However, Rate didn't guarantee anything, but he said he would try his best. He then gave him one of his medicine bottles for the injured man to drink. The soldier took the bottle and sniffed, observed, and even licked it to ensure that it wasn't harmful in any way. Rate told the soldier to randomly choose any of the bottles, and anyone which he chose, he would drink it to prove that it wasn't harmful. A bottle was chosen and Rate gulped down every drop of it. This act of Rate's had cleared the soldier's suspicion. The hot teenage girl then offered to administer the medicine to the old man who was her father. On drinking the medicine, his wounds instantly began to close up, and even his face became more attractive. No homo. They were marveled at the power of Rate's medicine and even wondered whether it was a high-level potion. However, it was just a basic level 2 potion. This baffled Rate, but he just assumed that they weren't used to making potions. He offered the soldier a healing potion since he had been injured as well. He replied by stating that he was simply a mere and humble guard, so they should save the potion for someone else. Rate told him to shut the fuck up and just drink the darn potion since he had so many of them. After the guard had drank it, he remarked that he was indebted to Rate, but Rate did well to remind him that if he wasn't safe yet and if he didn't do anything about the bear's poison, he was going to die anyway. The guard was shocked that Rate would be able to do something about the poison. Rate then inquired about the guard's condition and also asked how far the venom had gone in his body. He replied saying that all he was experiencing was a little numbness in his fingers. Rate immediately deduced that it was a paralyzing toxin, and if they left it as it was, the toxin would reach his heart and he would eventually die. However, he couldn't prepare an antidote out there in the woods, so he offered to take them back to his house so he could prepare the antidote for the bear poison. The guard carried the injured man on his back while they walked back to Rate's house. On entering, the visitors were shocked that a house such Rate's existed in that barbaric wilderness. Rate remarked saying that although the house was nice, it was still a bit empty. He then urged them to wait in the living room so he would go make the antidote and bring it to them. The guard questioned Rate on whether he was a doctor since he was so knowledgeable on drug matters. He replied saying was no drug expert. He just knew how to make many things. He then advised the guard to watch the procedure on how to make the antidote if he wanted to ensure his safety in the future. The guard took his advice, but asked for a few minutes so he could put the weak old man in bed. Moments later, Rate offered the guard some water, and he had immediately gulped it down without a second thought. Rate then inquired about his condition and the guard replied by saying that his entire arm had now become numb, and also wondered if it was too late for him to be saved. Rate mentioned that there was nothing to worry about, and they had more than enough time. The poison had only gotten up to his arm, which meant that it was progressing slowly, and at the rate at which he was preparing the antidote, he would have prepared the antidote with enough time to spare. As expected, the herbs he had picked for the antidote were lacking in quality. However, if he were to mix it carefully, he would be able to work his way around it. One had to get very creative when creating potions with low-quality materials. A while later, the antidotes had been prepared and 2 bowls of it were placed before the guard and the hot girl. The guard proceeded to drink one of them just to ensure that it wasn't poisoned. I don't buy that. Once he drank it, he widened his eyes in shock at how effective the antidote was. His numbness had totally disappeared without a trace, so Rate suggested that he give the medicine to the old man since he was in a way worse condition and wasn't going to make it if they didn't hurry. So the girl quickly made her way to his room with the potion. She gave it to him to drink, and his face looked even more rejuvenated than before. Rate then mentioned that he had dealt with the man's poison and had patched him up, and if he rests now, he would wake up soon. He then handed the girl another potion which should be used strictly for emergencies. Now that everyone was healed, Rate said he wanted to talk. He wanted to know who they were and what they were doing in the place he had found them. The girl spoke up to reply, saying that she would explain who they were. However, he would have to wait for her father to wake up so he would be the one to explain reasons for being in the forest. The soldier started off by introducing himself as Goldo, an imperial guard of the kingdom of Mythais, and the girl introduced herself as Lumia Mythais, the princess of the Mythais kingdoms, and her father as Leas Mythais, the 14th king of the Mythais kingdom. Rate had a habit of avoiding negotiations with people of higher standing. However, this time he was dealing with a king. He knew he had to be careful with his actions and wondered what would be his next move. Lumia pleaded with Rate to keep their identities as royalty a secret. He didn't wish to be known as Late anymore, so he made a new name and introduced himself as Late, which rhymed with his real name Late. How smart. He then said that for now, they should wait for the king to awaken. Subsequently, he would decide on the next course of action. Lumia then inquired about whether he was planning to lend them some help. From her most recent statement, Late had gotten the information that they needed some kind of help. Lumia then realized that she had fucked up, so she covered her mouth while Goldo gave her a look of disappointment. Late decided that they would talk about it later, and also suggested that they all had something to eat. He is seen outside unloading the frog meat which he had stored earlier in his item box, and to his surprise, it was still fresh, unlike his haircut. Apparently, the food he stored in the item box didn't get rotten but rather remained fresh. Less than a minute later, he is seen roasting the meat over a firewood flame. Moments later, Princess Lumia is seen next to him, inquiring about what he was doing. Late replied by saying that he was preparing some skewered monster frog, but didn't really know what it was called. Lumia was shocked at the fact of eating a monster whose name he was unaware of. He then mentioned that they wouldn't likely die of poisoning since he had all those antidotes stored. She was rather impressed on seeing how solid his logic was. Late was surprised by her reaction, as he had expected her to complain at how unfit the food would be for a princess like her. Goldo then appeared and instantly turned into a karate master and karate chopped the air between Late and Lumia, which separated them both. He went on to warn Lumia not to fall for Late's trickery. Goldo also mentioned that he himself once used to be a commoner, and commoners don't just go around eating unknown monsters all willy-nilly. Late didn't give a shit about what Goldo was going on about. He then continued to eat his unknown frog meat and mentioned that the bits of fat in the meat made the meat very tender. Goldo then mentioned that unfortunately, they didn't carry any food supplies along with them, and also blurted out that they were in a complicated situation. Late immediately picked that up but decided to wait for the king to wake up for proper questioning. Late again offered Goldo some meat, so he would check if it contained poison because Late sensed that despite all he had done for them, they still didn't trust him. Goldo accepted the meat, and on his first bite, for a moment, his miserable life as a royal guard had instantly become the greatest fantasy of a sad middle-aged man. A hot beach day with an even hotter woman chasing him. Goldo then remarked saying that Late's meat was delicious. Lumia then asked Goldo whether she could have some of Late's meat. I meant the meat he cooked. Goldo gave her a green light to have some, seeing that he didn't have any foul experiences with it. Lumia was about to dig into the meat, but then thought, "Hold on, I'm a royal bitch." She then asked Late for a plate which she would use to eat it, so Late quickly made use of his metamorphosis technique to craft a plate. Both Goldo and Lumia were shocked at how he had just crafted something out of thin air. Lumia took her bite, and her mind began to wander just like Goldo's had, just that her fantasy was a bit strange, where she was dressed in a bikini and was having a romantic time with a weird frog man. A few minutes later, Late noticed that Goldo wasn't eating anymore, so he inquired about it. Golds replied saying that since he was a bodyguard, he should refrain from eating when food was scarce. Late then made him aware that there was more than enough of his meat to go around. "Don't judge my wording." Goldo immediately accepted it, and clarified that he was more indebted to Late than a graduate of an Ivy League school was to their student loan board. Goldo mentioned that even back at his castle, there wasn't even meat as good as the one they had just eaten. Lumia recalled that Late mentioned it was frog meat, but she was surprised that there was one as delicious as that in the wilderness. Lumia then wondered whether it could be a Galia frog. Goldo then reminded her that Galia frogs were extremely difficult to prepare, and it wasn't the kind of thing that one could just stumble upon in a forest. However, Lumia mentioned that she had eaten Galia frogs in the past, and they tasted exactly like the frog which Late had prepared. They were so difficult to prepare that while they were in the castle, the king asked for them once, and out of over 100 royal chefs, only one was able to make it edible. Late then asked what made it so hard. Goldo replied saying that inside the frog's body, there were about 10 fragile poison sacs. If a person were to even scratch just one of them, the entire frog would be poisoned and deemed inedible. The procedure of preparing a Galia frog sounded a bit familiar to Late, so he showed them a dish of the frog he had killed, and asked whether that was the Galia frog. Lumia and Goldo were shocked to see that it was indeed a Galia frog, and on top of that, it was undamaged. Late then showed it to Goldo, all while forcefully shoving it into his fat and ugly face. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, which took Late by surprise because he didn't expect anyone to visit his house so abruptly. Goldo shouted, with aim to find out who was at the door. A voice then replied him which recognized Goldo's voice and made him aware that it was his comrade named Raisel. Goldo then told him to come in, and a boy who looked like he had been skipping every workout day walked in. His name was Raisel, a fellow night guard to the royal family. He observed that the princess was there too and was pleased that she was in good health. Goldo then inquired about whether he had been able to find any help, but he replied saying that he hadn't found anyone. This was the first house he had encountered, and when he knocked he discovered that they were inside. Raisel then asked what the hell that weird stranger was doing here with the princess while giving him a cold hard stare. He also asked of what kind of place they were in, because it looked rather peculiar to him. To them all, Late was still seen as Late, which was his alias, so Goldo replied by saying it was Late's house. Raisel was confused on hearing that name and wondered whether he was going to be a friend or foe. Goldo explained that he was just a mere commoner, although he didn't look like one. Princess Lumia further explained that had been a huge to them. He had killed the beast which had attacked them and healed their wounds from the attack. Even the king was resting in one of his rooms. He had been poisoned by the beast, but Late had whipped up a very effective antidote, so the king would be fine. Raisel was suspicious at how convenient it was for this stranger to just randomly appear, and be willing to go out of his way, and offer such a great amount of help. She suspected that he had some kind of hidden agenda, so he urged Goldo and the princess to get the hell out of there. Lumia then reminded Raisel's dumbass that the forest was filled with dangerous monsters, so there wasn't any place safer than that house. She also didn't appreciate the way which he spoke about the one who had saved both her and her father. Raisel was shocked at the way the princess had raised her voice at him, because it was a rare occurrence to see her that upset. Late then proceeded to open and close the window to show them that they weren't locked in. He then mentioned that if he were actually planning to do something to them, he wouldn't have let them roam freely in a room that wasn't even locked. However, Raisel still didn't believe his story. Late remarked by saying that if he wanted to, he could easily kill them all even if they attacked him at once. But he didn't do that because he didn't have any intention to. He used Raisel as an example. He had let his guard down, so he had a lot of weak spots. So if Late wanted to, he could kill him in that very instant. He proceeded to call Raisel a pathetic weakling and called Goldo the strongest. However, it would still take about 10 seconds to kill him with only the weapons he had at hand. Raisel warned him to watch his mouth while calling him a filthy and arrogant bastard. Just as he was about to attack him, Princess Lumia stepped in and told them both to shut the fuck up, especially Raisel because she didn't appreciate the way he was talking to Late, the one who had saved them. She then informed Goldo to behead Raisel if he were to defy her orders again, seeing it as high treason. Goldo acknowledged her orders while keeping his blade on Raisel's skinny neck. Raisel was scared, so he proceeded to beg for mercy while bowing before Lumia. Late then realized that Lumia was one crazy bitch, because until then, she had behaved like a normal teenage girl. But now, she had displayed a rather frightening side of herself. Although the issue had been resolved, Late still sensed Raisel's resentment, so he decided to do something which would make things clear between them. He then asked permission from Princess Lumia to challenge him to a duel, where he suggested it would be a match with no rules. Raisel still had several ounces of resentment, and vowed to make him pay for his arrogance. However, Late realized that he had no chance in hell against an expert knight in a fair fight, so he decided to play dirty. Late explained that it wouldn't be a battle to the death, but rather a battle that would make them both understand each other better, all in the name of good combat. In reality, the name of good combat didn't mean shit to him. It was just that killing that princess's guard in a situation like this would be a huge blunder on his part. The princess thought over Late's request and recalled that although Raisel wasn't ready to be a full-fledged knight, he still had very remarkable strength. Goldo agreed with the princess and mentioned that he was ranked among the top 3 in their castle's elite imperial order of chivalry, and shouldn't be underestimated. Moments later, they all stepped out to the backyard, when Raisel reminded Late that he insisted that there wouldn't be any rules for this duel, and was just confirming whether it would remain like that, because he had been craving for an ass to kick. Late replied saying that it would remain the same, so he should attack him with killing intent. It wouldn't really matter because he possessed those potions which healed wounds in an instant. He then showed him the potion and Raisel thought to himself, what the fuck is that? Lumia then informed him that it was a level 1 healing potion which worked great. Raisel was shocked that a supposed commoner like Late was in possession of a level 1 potion, and began to question whether he was truly a commoner. Goldo remarked saying that he also suspected that Late wasn't just some lowly commoner, because the potions which he possessed would be enough to keep a regular person alive for the rest of their life. Raisel then asked whether he was a physician. In this world, people who prepared potions were called physicians. Since Late had prepared a few antidotes, Goldo assumed that he was formerly a personal physician for a kingdom. But Raisel doubted it because it wasn't likely that someone a kingdom would just let go of a physician who possessed something as valuable as a level 1 potion. Late found this physician talk very strange because in his world, such people were called alchemists. Goldo and Raisel further assumed that he was a physician who had fled from his kingdom and into the wilderness, which Late found to be ridiculous. However, it was still better than them knowing that he was from another world. Late then coughed loudly to draw both of their attention, and mentioned that he didn't appreciate them both prying into his past. Also, he wished for the mock battle to commence, and Goldo had volunteered to be the referee for the match. Moments later, the fight had commenced and both fighters took their preferred stances while glaring into each other's eyes. In Late's left hand, he had a flashbang ready, and after a few seconds, he threw it at Raisel to temporarily blind him and create an opening. While he was blinded, Late snuck up behind him and planned to land an overhead attack on him. However, Raisel still managed to block it, despite not being able to see. Late was definitely impressed and came to admit that he was truly an outstanding knight. Just then, Raisel let off a slash from his sword which was aimed directly at his throat. Late was aware that a real swordsman would be able to sense their enemy's presence, and it appeared that Raisel had already reached that level even though he was merely 20 years old, which explained how he was able to block his attack. In hindsight, it wouldn't be that difficult for Late to defeat Raisel. All he needed to do was to hide his presence, close the distance, and then thrust his weapon towards his neck. However, the duel would only be meaningful to him if he managed to win Raisel while demonstrating the differences in their strength. Late realized that Raisel had put so much faith in that sword of his, so the only way for him to win would be to shatter it. Late was feeling confident about winning the duel as their swords clashed, and Raisel had no choice but to commend him for being a formidable opponent. But Late replied saying he could go even further. Their swords were then in a stationary position where it boiled down to brute strength, but Raisel then informed Late that he couldn't win strictly with the use of brute strength. But he begged to differ. Moments later, Late had used his weapon to totally shatter Raisel's sword, which made Raisel's jaw drop. Late then jumped in the air towards him to deliver the final blow, when suddenly, Goldo yelled the words "game over," indicating that the fight had gone too far already, so Late held back his attack and walked away, knowing that he had defeated Raisel's sorry ass. Late had made use of bestowal magic in the battle, which wasn't a technique one would use in long battles due to the large burden it placed on the human body. With what he had done, he would only suffer a light muscle ache. However, if he used it against a high-ranked opponent, his body would hurt like hell, so he was thankful that Raisel was such a pathetic loser. Late took a look back and noticed that Raisel was crying over his broken sword, and proceeded to wonder how his sword had been broken so easily. Late replied saying that he had used a special technique to shatter his sword. However, he was lying and that was all bullshit. He actually just used his transformation magic to break the sword. Goldo then mentioned that he didn't notice any special sword style and couldn't believe that he was strong enough to do something like that. Late then inquired about Raisel's sword was considered to be a good one. Goldo replied saying that it was a masterpiece crafted by a master blacksmith, and Raisel had been given that sword after he was promoted to Imperial Knight. After hearing all this, Late began to feel like he had done something really wrong. He felt bad, so he offered to attempt to repair the sword, but as he picked up a piece of the sword, Raisel had snapped and immediately snatched the piece away from him. However, Raisel's loss didn't make him any less of a dumbass, so he held the blade by his palm, which injured his fingers. It was obvious that Raisel still had several atoms of resentment, so he walked out, but the princess ordered him to halt, asking him whether he didn't feel ashamed for acting like a worthless coward. Not only did he insult Late earlier, the behavior he had shown after losing the mock battle as a knight was a disgrace to his entire country. Princess Lumia then bowed to Late, apologizing and taking responsibility for Raisel's foolishness. Goldo urged the princess to stop bowing and to consider her position as royalty. Princess Lumia then asked Goldo to suggest a punishment fit for the disgraceful display which Raisel had put up. Goldo replied, saying that he had disobeyed the princess's orders numerous times and this behavior was a disgrace to their kingdom, so he couldn't avoid execution. On hearing that, the princess's eyes had widened. Just as Late has thought, since Lumia was merely a 15-year-old girl, she probably didn't wish to execute someone she had spent time with up to now. She proposed that they look for a punishment aside from execution. However, Goldo mentioned that in accordance to the rules of their kingdom, a knight who disgraced the dignity of the Imperial Knights would face a death penalty. Even Raisel himself had agreed and come to accept his fate. Suddenly, Late drew their attention and said that it wasn't necessary to kill anyone. He also thought to himself that it was a little too strict that one would face a death penalty just for speaking rudely. If it were like that everywhere, the Earth population would have been wiped out. The Knight Association of their kingdom was charged with the responsibility of ensuring the safety of the royal family, so it would make sense for them to be so strict. However, Late sensed that Princess Lumia didn't actually want to execute him, and at the same time, it wouldn't be good if the king woke up to find a dead Imperial Knight, as it could greatly have a negative influence on their negotiations. Late didn't have any obligation to protect Raisel, however. He felt that protecting him would somehow yield him a benefit. Late remarked saying that he was the only victim involved, and he didn't really care about what had happened. Goldo then mentioned that it was an issue greater than that, as it was a problem for the Imperial Knights Association. He placed his fist on his chest and began to narrate how the Knights Imperial Association was formed to protect the royal family. He and how tarnishing the reputation of the Knights Imperial Association would be equivalent to doing the same to the royal family, which was why their association held such strict rules. Late immediately understood that it was an issue of reputation. He then mentioned to Goldo that the only other people who witnessed Raisel's worthless and pathetic display of cowardice were Lumia and him. Therefore, if they all kept quiet, no one would know about it. Therefore, he and Lumia concluded that they would keep their traps shut about the whole incident. Goldo thought over it for a while, and suggested to the princess that she entrusted Raisel's life to him and Late. This was because their Knights Association has an exception which allows criminals' punishments to be delayed if a mission were required of them. Late immediately understood Goldo's logic. The execution would be postponed until the end of the mission. And if the mission never ends, the execution would never actually take place. But for that, one would need both the victim's consent as well as the consent of the person being charged. Now that the conditions of the exception had been made, Goldo would decide the details of the mission as he saw fit. Raisel then bowed his disgraceful head in thanks. Goldo then reminded Raisel that if he were to put up such an act again, he was going to have his head on a plate. He also informed Late that if he ever changed his mind, he shouldn't hesitate to tell him. Then he would immediately execute Raisel. Late was surprised at how he had somehow gained power over Raisel's life, as his plan for the mock battle was to demonstrate a bit of his power, and never expected it to end up like that. Later in the afternoon, we see Late dropping an extra bowl of water for Princess Lumia to use and wash her unconscious father's face. When Late felt the bed and asked her whether her bed wasn't a little too hard, Princess Lumia then sat down on it to get a feel, and she remarked saying that she thought of all the furniture in the house as first class. Late smiled and mentioned that he planned on using a piece of Raisel's sword to make an even better bed. Raisel's sword had been confiscated and given to him after their dispute earlier. It was an order from Princess Lumia and he couldn't disobey, unless he wanted to be unalived. So he had no choice but to give Late the blade against his own will. Lumia thought he was going to make use of the sword to make the metal fittings. However, he was going to use them for the mattress. She immediately thought he was intending to use it for torture and informed him that torture with a legitimate reason was against the law. But if you were buddies with the royal family, you could probably get away with it. Late then assured her that it wasn't for torture, and he was just making a normal bed. She most likely imagined a bed with a sword sticking out of it, which actually wasn't a bad idea. Relax, I'm joking. He then used his transformation magic to craft springs, which would be used as the base for the mattress. While he was preparing it, Raisel observed him using his sword to craft something, and proceeded just when we thought he couldn't get any uglier. He gave off the ugliest face we had ever seen. When shortly after, Goldo yelled his name, which implied that he should get his ass back to work. Just moments later, Late was done with adding the springs to the mattress. He then covered it with a sheet and used his magic to combine everything together. After he was done, he sat down on it and remarked on how comfortable it was, and also suggested that Lumia give it a try. She observed it and was marveled at how he had made such a bed with pieces of a metal sword. She then sat down on it and the springs on the bed had propelled her upwards. When she landed, she began to state how she had never seen a bed as amazing and soft as this one. She began to praise him for being able to not only make incredible medicine, but he could also make an amazing bed from pieces of a sword. He also realized that he could make quite the amount of profit if he could mass produce them, but he wasn't really feeling it though. Late then mentioned that he would be going around the house to remake several other beds like that, since he had some free time, so Lumia waited for him to be gone. She then jumped onto the bed like a little kid. Oh shit, she actually was a little kid. She also tried all sorts of positions on the bed. I meant sleeping positions. Just then, Late walked in and threw her a pillow which he had just made. She then hugged the fluffy pillow so tightly, and also blushed at Late as he walked out. A while later, Lumia saw Late working and had a request but was hesitant to ask. Late noticed this and asked her whether she needed anything. She then asked whether it would be okay for her to take the bed back to her royal palace. Late was surprised that it was the bed which she was so hesitant to ask for. He however said it was okay. Provided he had enough materials, he could make as many as he wished, which was sweet music to her ears, so she thanked him while hugging her pillow. Meanwhile, Raisel was being worked hopelessly into the ground. The next morning, Lumia was surprised to see her father had awakened. The king himself was surprised to see that he was still in one piece. He woke up and Late informed him that it was all thanks to the level 2 potion which he had prepared by himself. The king began to laugh hysterically because he didn't believe some random commoner would be able to create such a potion. King Lias then asked him to prove himself by preparing one before his very eyes. Late agreed to it. But in exchange, Lias would have to explain what he was doing injured in the woods. He then gave Late a cold stare while questioning whether he dared to bargain with the king. His cold stare immediately turned into a smile, and agreed to Late's terms, however, only after he had prepared an authentic level 2 potion. Lumia then asked her father whether he was sure about this decision of his. King Lias put her worries to rest by saying that he really needed someone to help him, and a physician who was able to make level 2 potions would be able to aid him. He then took them all to the kitchen where he was going to whip up the potion. He then spread the ingredients on a table which consisted of a base of Megia grass. He put the grass in a bowl and began to grind it with a pistol. The king commended him for his good form of execution. He replied by saying that it was because he was a pro-physician. That's straight cap. After he had ground it into a liquid consistency, he began to boil it. It boiled until night had fallen, and then it was finally ready. It was observed to have a clear red color. The red color indicated that it was a level 2 potion. He then poured it into a bottle and was ready for usage. The king then offered to test it. Although he wasn't injured, he then grabbed a knife and proceeded to make a cut on his palm, which made Goldo and Lumia scream in concern for his well-being. He opened the bottle and poured the potion over the cut, and it got healed at that instant. Even Late was concerned that the king had just experimented on himself as if he were some lowly commoner. The king then mentioned that he couldn't have experimented on someone else, and if the medicine was real, he wouldn't have anything to worry about. The king, the princess, and Late down to talk. Leas had decided to hold up his end of the bargain by explaining their situation. However, Late had to vow not to speak of the contents of their conversation, which Late agreed to. The king finally confessed that his purpose for being there was assassination. Apparently, the prince's guards had been assassinated by a sorcerer named Sadarks, who made use of transfer magic. The king could have been able to fight, but he couldn't deal with it quick enough and got injured. Late now understood that they were on an assassination mission while utilizing transfer magic. However, transfer magic wasn't strong enough to kill a person. But if traps were set before the transfer L, it could even kill a high-ranking player who would normally be unkillable. After the king had narrated the story, Goldo immediately fell to his knees while apologizing for being not risking his life to protect him. Leas urged Goldo to lift his head and informed him that literally no one could have protected him in the situation he was in. The king further assumed that Goldo was the one who had defeated the monster in the wilderness. Goldo then corrected him by stating that it was Late who had defeated the monster. Leas was shocked to hear that it was the supposed physician who had defeated the beast. Late remarked saying that all he did was poison it. Just then, the king had remembered that he suffered a fatal wound from the bear, and wondered whether it was all a dream. Late then showed him a bottle of poison which he had prepared using some natural ingredients. Leas then concluded that Late was some sort of pro-poisoner. Goldo also mentioned that although he claimed to be a simple physician, he was still good at physical combat and had even beaten Raisel in a mock battle. The king recalled that Raisel, although he was a worthless scumbag, had sword skills which were considered to be first class, and some random physician had put his lights out. Goldo also mentioned that he made use of a special technique which shattered Raisel's special sword. After hearing all of Late's recent doings, the king offered Late a chance to work with him by helping him return his castle safely. The surrounding forest was pretty dangerous, but with the help of an excellent physician like him, his safe return to the castle would be guaranteed. However, Late didn't think returning to the castle would solve all of his problems because the person who had transferred a monster in front of him wouldn't likely give him a warm welcome. Sadarks was likely being executed as a traitor as they spoke. He had always been a shady character, so if the king suddenly disappeared, he would be the one suspected of. Late interrupted Leas and asked why such a suspicious man had connections to the prince's guards. Just then, the king realized that he had fucked up by making that guy responsible for guarding Cassus, which was the name of the prince. Late then asked how suspicious this Sadarks dude was behaving. Leas replied by saying that one after the other, very obvious and suspicious deaths happened around Sadark. There were also some rumors that he put strange things in his food. In reality, Leas would rather hire adventurers than make him Cassus's guard. From all Late had observed, it was obvious to him that Sadark's actions were only punishable by execution. The king realized that he should have had him executed a long time ago, but he never did. Rather, all he gave him as punishment was to wash dirty dishes, after which he was immediately forgiven. Late then asked whether anyone around objected to his poor judgments. However, it turned out that no one ever said anything against it, not even the fat-mouthed prime minister. Late then began to understand just how this sorcerer was making these things happen. Line manipulation. It was a difficult spell to cast, however, it depended on the level of manipulation. But if Late were to investigate the inconsistencies in its memory, he was certain he would be able to break it. Meanwhile, in the castle, we observed Sadarks, who had just noticed that the manipulation spell he had cast on Leas had been cancelled, and began to wonder whether someone had saved him from the spell. But it didn't matter to him. He then vowed that no matter the situation, he was not going to let anything stop Lura's Mara's wish, whoever that was. He also mentioned that he was going to ensure that a gentleman named Riaz would slowly experience severe suffering and despair. That's if he is even still alive. Meanwhile, in Late's house, the king asked whether Sadarks was hated by everyone, which Late gave a confirmation response. Suddenly, the three royals had all widened their eyes as if they had just snapped out from a heavy trance. The king then came to the realization that everyone in the castle was still allied with Sadarks despite all of his butchering. I mean brutality. Leas didn't want to believe that his so loyal subjects had all conspired with Sadarks to throw him out of his kingdom. Late then just assumed that their politics were just shit. Leas went on to say that there weren't many kings who thought about his people's lives like he did. And ever since he had become a king, the amount of money the royal had used was less than half of what had been spent by the previous generation of royals. So the solution wouldn't be to just cut off the required political expenses. Either that, or he would just become a broke ass. Late understood the current situation and was certain that Sadarks used mind manipulation, and assumed that folks back at the castle were all brainwashed by now. The king didn't understand what Late meant by mind manipulation magic, so he explained that it was a kind of magic used by sorcerers on people's minds to make them do as he wished. Late was familiar with mind manipulation magic from VLO, however, it was used only by villain NPCs and not players. Lumia then proceeded to state the obvious, being that no one was suspicious of him as a result of his mind manipulation magic. However, there was still something troubling the king's mind. Sadarks could have easily manipulated him without driving him out of the kingdom, so he wondered why he didn't do that. Late then mentioned that all royals and high-level adventurers had a high resistance to mind manipulation magic, which was probably why he simply just drove him out of the castle. Leas understood Late's logic and concluded that he had to put an end to his reign of terror. If he was truly using mind manipulation magic, then his kingdom would definitely be taken over. However, he didn't know how to go about it. Late then mentioned that there was a basic solution to this problem of his, which intrigued the king. He then informed them that if the user of mind manipulation magic were to be killed, it would free all the minds which had been held captive. However, Lea's mind still wasn't at rest on hearing Late's suggestion, so he made it aware to him that Sadarks wasn't exactly the easiest person to kill. Late replied saying that they should then just utilize a more complicated method to kill him. Leas explained that there was a strong defense network in the royal palace, so slipping past it would be almost impossible. Late replied saying that if this oh-so-solid defense network allowed a mind manipulation mage to infiltrate it, they wouldn't have any issue breaking in. Leas got annoyed at Late's perceived arrogance and went on to say that only a professional and well-trained assassin would be capable of breaking through the royal palace's defense. And even if there were one like that, they wouldn't even be able to contact him. Late told him not to be so quick to assume and mentioned that he could introduce them to one. At first, the king spoke words of doubt about him knowing a real assassin. Late then reminded that he was a doctor who could prepare level 2 potions, so it wouldn't be weird for him to have some good connections. The king then stated that he made a good point. However, Leas stated that Sadarks couldn't be killed by just any assassin, since his palace was basically impregnable, as it had defended against several assassins and rogues. Late then inquired about what exactly he meant by impregnable. He then also asked whether it consisted of an indestructible barrier, magic disruption barrier, and space disruption barrier, which were some of the strongest barrier classes in VLO, and if they were used in that combination, destroying it would be quite difficult. However, the king then mentioned that it wasn't a mythical barrier, and the outer wall's defense ranking was a class of immovable barrier. Late was then aware his kingdom's defense was basically dog shit, since an immovable barrier had a middle to low ranking in VLO. He then asked what the defense on the exterior of the castle, such as the windows, were like. Leas replied saying that there was no defensive magic on the windows. The distance between the outside grounds and the windows was too far for magic to reach in the first place. Late knew how easy this mission would be for him, and also realized that he hadn't been given such an easy assassination in a while. Late then mentioned that the assassination would be possible, but it depended on the reward. Leas then reminded him that Sadarks was a high-ranking sorcerer who was protected by an immovable barrier. Late then said to the king that if he couldn't handle someone like Sadarks, he wouldn't call himself an assassin. The king mentioned that if someone like the person Late had just described really existed, he would need his help very urgently. But he still wondered whether the person would be able to pull off the assassination. Late assured him that it would definitely succeed. He even said that he could give the reward after the mission was completed. However, if he were to fail, he would commit suicide on the spot. The king then agreed to Late's terms and asked for an introduction to the assassin. He then snapped his fingers, which unveiled all his assassin weaponry, and then introduced himself to them all as Late, the doctor and now an assassin. They all were shocked because they all thought he was just a regular old doctor. Late then mentioned that the assassin he was going to introduce to them was him, a magic being of his, then proceeded to make them all some tea. Late went on to say that as an assassin, being a physician by profession was a nice accolade, because the best and simplest way to kill was by administering poison to the target, he said while sipping his tea. Leas then mentioned that he probably had a counter for every poison out there. Late then gave an instance of a drug which was undetectable as poison, being mixed inside the target's body to produce toxicity. Leas then inquired about he was going to administer such a poison. He replied by saying that he would just locate the fields where food being supplied to the royal family was being grown, and scatter the poison across the soil. He would make it in such a way that it would be absorbed by plants. Next, he would make a magic flying tool to hide in the clouds and poison it with the rain so it won't be detectable. Leas thought it was nonsense and didn't believe he could create a magic flying tool so easily. Without saying anything, Late then grabbed a metal substance and used his bestowal magic on it to create a gun. His magic being then proceeded to throw a teacup in the direction of the king. Just before it hit, the teacup had shattered as a result of a bullet from Late's gun. The purpose of that was to demonstrate that he could create any magic tool, however, only given the right materials. Late then told them to quiet down and leave the assassination. Leas mentioned to Late that if he could defeat the sorcerer Sadarks with the method he had stated earlier, he wouldn't hold back on the rewards. He then proceeded to ask him what he wanted. Late meant business, so he replied by saying that he wished for a land for a workshop, concealment of his information, and a cooperative relationship with the kingdom. Leas understood why he would want land, but didn't understand what he meant by concealment of information and a cooperative relationship. Late then explained that it would be a real pain in the ass if he got exposed as an assassin, and he also wanted to conceal the fact that he had a production job from others, except the ones he could trust. And for the partnership, it would just be a cooperative relationship. It didn't matter who was in a higher position. To clarify this, if one person wanted something, they could just ask each other for it. The other party could then choose to accept or decline the request on their free will. The king realized how big of a deal this cooperative relationship was, but still decided to accept because he didn't really have much of a choice. So they shook hands, which indicated that the deal was official. Late's target was sorcerer Sadarks, and his rewards were land for a workshop, concealment of information, and a cooperative relationship with the kingdom. Leas then inquired about the supposed duration of this assassination mission, so he replied saying that the poison sprinkling method which he had suggested earlier would take several months to complete, so attacking head-on would be much faster. The king then said to him that he preferred a faster approach, however, he should still utilize one which wouldn't allow a chance for failure. The king then asked whether he would be able to do it, so with a smile on Late's crusty face, he replied saying that it would entirely depend on the enemy's defensive readiness. He then asked Leas to explain with extreme detail how solid the palace's defenses were, as well as the magic assassination target which Sadarks made use of. Leas mentioned that he would only be aware of the defensive readiness back when he was still active as a king. However, it might have changed by now. Late didn't mind and said he would investigate the more important parts by himself. Princess Lumia was walking down the hall when she heard several voices coming from the living room. So she entered and saw her father just about rounding up his explanation of the details of the defense system of his kingdom. Technically it wasn't his kingdom anymore, but still, let a man dream. After his explanation, Leas then asked Late whether he would be able to do anything about it. He replied by saying that if the information he had given him was correct, it was rare to see such an easy assassination operation, and mentioned that he would be able to handle it with magic tools only. Leas was shocked to hear him call this mission easy. Late then mentioned that he would be going with a magic tool assassination method. The king was a dumbass when it came to assassination, so he said he would trust Late's method of execution. Late asked Goldo to confirm whether the royal capital were 3 hours away from their current location, and he replied by saying that since they were near Leneralia, that would be correct. Late mentioned that if he had all the material he required, he would be able to kill him in a single day. He required 500 magic stones, 30 kilograms of iron, and 10 kilograms of bronze. He then asked Goldo whether he would be able to supply it. He replied by saying that there was a store in Leneralia where they could buy all the items he required. He proceeded to ask Goldo whether he had any money. Goldo then searched both his pockets and made the sudden realization of, oh shit, I'm broke. Late then asked the others for some cash, but they were all broke too. But truthfully, despite all his assassination and production skills, Late was even more broke. Late asked Goldo whether he couldn't just do an invoice. He replied by saying that we would see what he could do. He would contact the chivalric order for the invoice for the people involved in the order. However, he didn't want the fact that he was still alive to be exposed, so Late asked whether it would be possible for him to get the material without contacting the order, even if it would be only possible to get copper and iron. He would manage to obtain magic stones from hunting monsters. The king then said that 30 kilograms of copper and 10 kilograms of iron cost a lot of money, so getting them those materials without the aid of the Knights Chivalric Order wouldn't be an easy task. Late was aware that copper was a rare metal, and with the technology in this world, refining it wouldn't be easy, therefore making the price higher than it should be. He knew that he couldn't do without those materials, so he decided to sell something to obtain the money. He noticed the level 2 potions on the table, so he picked them up and asked whether he could sell those. The king then told him that he could sell them, but the price wouldn't be pleasing to him. He then asked whether he could sell one of a different level. If time wasn't a constraint, he could probably whip up some level 4 potions. They all were left with their jaws hanging when Late mentioned such a high-level potion. However, Goldo didn't doubt he would be able to make it. The king then mentioned that if he prepared such a potion, it would make him stand out, which was the opposite of what he was going for. Leas then explained that potions were so valuable all the level 2 ones produced were given straight to the royal family, and about only one bottle was made every 3 years, and even only a few level 1 potions were made each year. Talk more of a level 4 potion. Late was surprised at how valuable they were and then suggested he make level 0 potions. Leas replied saying that level 0 potions were quite valuable and would be a more reasonable choice, so Late agreed that it would be those potions which he would be preparing. It wasn't apparent that Late would be preparing potions which were on the same level as the king's IQ. Level 0. He then proceeded to pour some pure water into a cauldron filled with the level 2 potion, which made the others put on hideous and concerning faces. Late assumed that they were all so dumb that they didn't know that diluting a high-level potion with water would turn it into a lower-level potion. Leas replied saying that he knew that much. What concerned them was the fact that he had just diluted a potion which their kingdom got once every few years to make level 0 potions which were sold everywhere. Late told them to calm their asses down and that he could make as many level 2 potions as he wished. Also, saving the kingdom was more important. Leas then mentioned that this was the first time the king had witnessed potions being altered in such a way, so it caught him by surprise. A while later, Late had finished and arranged numerous bottles of level 0 potions, which were all ready to be sold. Goldo then asked whether it would be okay for him to sell it at night. Late then wondered why he would want to wait until night before selling it. Goldo mentioned that if he went to sell, he would have been seen by the chivalric order. He didn't know who could possibly be enemy, so he wished to avoid risk. Late understood the situation and devised a means for him to move and be undetected by the chivalric order. He used his magic to craft a magical disguising tool. Goldo held it and immediately transformed into an ugly middle-aged man who looked like he didn't have anything to live for. Leas then remarked by saying that he couldn't even recognize him at all. Late then showed Goldo his reflection. He was surprised to see how ugly his face is, and even more surprised that he was able to make such a tool. Late then offered to take Goldo to the since carrying 500 magic stones wouldn't be that easy to do. He told Late not to worry himself that Raisel had it covered already. And just when I thought Raisel couldn't get any uglier, he surpassed my expectations. He had used the magic disguising tool to conceal his true appearance. Late said it was alright, and also informed them that their voices couldn't be altered, so they should be careful about whom they interact with. Goldo then mentioned that he would like to return his face to normal when he was negotiating, so Late informed them that they needed to quietly say the word terminate to return their original and crusty faces, and say activate if they wanted to be disguised again. Goldo and Raisel now understood how the magic tool worked, so they headed into the city to sell the potions. Moments later, Late realized that his house wasn't the most suitable for the production of magic tools for assassination, so he decided to build it. He had some materials from earlier, and as he bent down to gather them, Leas appeared behind him, saying that he had something else to discuss with him. Leas asked whether the magic disguising tool could make one transform into a specific person. Late observed his perceptive nature and replied by saying that it would take him some time to Late out, but would still be possible. He then asked him what he would want to use it for. Leas said he would rather not use it at the moment, but would have a use for it later in the future, and also made a request for one after the assassination succeeded. Late agreed to this, but only on the condition that he got paid accordingly. Just then, Lumia stuck her head out the window and was in an excited mood because Mackie had managed to repair his old clothes, and were now good as new. She noticed that Late and her father appeared to be having a serious conversation, so she asked whether she was interrupting. Her father then told her that they had just rounded up their conversation, so she had nothing to worry about, after which he went into the house. Without any further interruptions, it was time for Late to build his workshop. While using his combination and transformation magic, he reminded himself that his main goal was not to defeat Sorcerer Sadarks, rather it was to defeat the evil god Master Azul, this current assassination mission. And his partnership with the royal palace was just a mere checkpoint, because the Macy's kingdom might be useful for fighting something as mysterious as an evil god. Since a god's strength depended on the faith of their believers, there would be plenty of use of a country which governed those people. To sum it up, he just wanted to be on good terms with the kingdom. A few hours later, Raisel and Goldo had returned from their conquest with a big-ass box. The king then inquired about whether their goal of their journey was achieved. They managed to get the 30 kilograms of iron, 10 kilograms of copper and 500 magic stones. Late was surprised that just 2 people were able to carry such heavy load over such a long distance. Late picked up the iron and immediately examined it, not to be of the best quality, but was still good enough to be used as material. He then picked up a piece of iron, and when Goldo saw this, he was so shocked and made a face which was somehow even uglier than his normal face. He then touched Late's skinny arm and remarked that he was quite strong despite the fact that he was skipping arm day. Late then stumbled upon a medicinal herb which Raisel had picked for him to aid his production of potions and magic tools, which made Late give a smile in Raisel's direction. Raisel then quickly looked away, which was the same as him saying, "Hold up bro, I'm not gay." Now that Late had all the material required to make the magic tool, it was time to start production. He then informed Goldo that he would be sealing off the entrance and windows, so if he needed anything, he would need to call him from outside. Goldo, while whispering, asked Late whether the recipe for the magic tools was a secret. He replied saying that it was most definitely a secret, but the main reason for locking down the room was because it was dangerous. It was obvious that a tool designed specifically for killing people wouldn't be the safest. He then offered to keep an eye on Raisel, so that his dumbass doesn't try to force the door open. Late thanked him and also assured him that he would handle the rest. He also reminded him that since they were going to the royal palace tomorrow, he had prepared an open-air bath which he could rest in. He didn't want Goldo to fuck up the mission, so he asked him to go rest and restore his energy. He was surprised when Late said they were carrying out the mission the next morning, which implied that he was going to use up all those materials before the morning. Late mentioned that he planned to stay up all night, and considering his situation, he couldn't afford to slack off. He then used his transformation magic to finish building his secret mobile shop. A while later, Late's magic flying tool flew into the house's common area, which took everyone surprised. So Raisel and Goldo were ready to attack it when Late suddenly appeared. He uttered the magic word terminate, which destroyed it before it could harm anybody. He apologized because he accidentally let it escape from his workshop while testing it, and now it was finally finished. He then showed them a gigantic load and asked whether they would be able to carry it because those contents were the things had produced that same day. And he packaged it in such a way that even if one were to drop it or bump into it, the contents still wouldn't be damaged. King Leas walked in his neat-looking formal attire, and judging by the look which him and Late gave each other, they both knew that it was time for the assassination operation to begin. This was also Late's first assassination since coming to this world. He then asked whether they remembered the plan. Goldo then began to narrate how they were to arrive in the town in a disguise, then stand by at the Wyvern's hiding place, wait for contact with the magic tool, and when the assassination succeeded, they would show themselves. Leas then mentioned to Late that after he defeated Sadarks, he should leave the rest to him. Late then urged everyone to disguise themselves by making use of the magic disguise tool. After they had concealed their identities, Goldo noticed that his disguise was different from before and was even uglier than yesterday. Late replied by saying that he changed his appearance so that it wouldn't leave any impression. Late noticed that everyone was nervous about this mission, especially Princess Lumia. Well, if this mission were to fail, then the Macy's kingdom would be nothing but a story for the history books. Goldo terminated his disguise and asked whether it would be possible for them to change their gender. "Let's just hope that it's not what I'm thinking." He explained that yesterday, he observed some wanted posters in the city of Lenalia. The targets were 3 males and 1 female, which might be an alert which Sadarks had raised. He then suggested that they change the gender composition of their group, so that people wouldn't be wary of them. Late understood this, but he then thought that it would also alert people if everyone in the group were a male. Raisel then proposed that their group should consist of 2 males and 2 females, which Goldo found to be appropriate. Late then assigned roles to each of them, with Goldo being the mom, Raisel the dad, and ironically, Princess Lumia and King Leas as the children. They were trying to use the disguise of a peddler who carried his wife and kids along with him. King Leas then mentioned that since they were acting as merchants, he would be the best fit for the role of the father. However, Late then stated that with the information he had gathered yesterday, there was a high tendency that there were people in the kingdom who were on the lookout for him. Even if he changed his voice, his manner of speaking wouldn't change, so it would be better if he played a role which didn't fit him. Late then asked Goldo and Raisel whether they were okay with the conditions, and they confirmed that they were. He then informed them that to change their gender, they would need to press the button on top of the magic tool. Goldo then transformed into a hot and beautiful woman. However, she was a little too tall. Raisel feared that he might stand out a lot. He then spoke with his horrid frog voice, so the king and Raisel urged him not to speak with that horrid voice and such a beautiful body. The princess then began to laugh hysterically, which drew the attention of the others. She then apologized for such an outburst. They had all transformed and were ready for the mission, and the time for which they took the Mises kingdom was nigh. We observe Sate making use of his transformation techniques to build numerous magic rat-looking minions, which would be a key factor to the success of the operation. All the mission data had been input into his system and everything was functioning properly, so he ordered his minions to begin their journey. The others had reached the kingdom in their goofy disguises, where they had experienced just what Sate had predicted. The commoners in the kingdom looked like they were just having normal conversations with each other. However, their eyes appeared to be clouded and giving a lifeless vibe, as if they all were being controlled by someone. Just then, Princess Lumia accidentally bumped into a man who was as fat and ugly as a person could get. Lumia trembled in fear at the sight of him standing over her, but mostly at the sight of his ugly face. Raisel went up to the dude and was ready to throw hands when Goldo offered the man some money, which pleased him, so he backed off. After that scene, they continued their journey. Goldo then asked Raisel whether he still held a grudge against Sate. He replied saying that he held no grudge. He realized that if things got too intense and a fight had started among themselves, the entire plan would be smoked. Raisel appeared to have grown more mature since his first encounter with Sate. He went on to mention that this was a delicate time when one shouldn't allow their personal matters interfere with the goal of the mission. Raisel then asked King Leas whether he would be fine with staying in such an ordinary rank house. Leas replied saying that staying in a more luxurious house would attract a fair amount of attraction and begin to arouse suspicion. Therefore, the best place for them to stay would be the wyvern's hiding spot. Meanwhile, Sate was using his magic flying tool to scout the whole kingdom, searching for Sadarks. Since he was a supposed high-ranking sorcerer, his magic should stand out. Moments later, he sensed a large magic presence and just knew that Sadarks was lurking around there. Suddenly, he also sensed a magic barrier which had been applied. Immediately he began to approach it. However, the barrier could easily be broken at impact from the inside, so a bombing with magical tools would be impossible. It was also strong against outside impact, which meant that no matter how strict the royal palace's security was, there was no chance in hell. They were conscious about a sewer line which was about 30 centimeters wide, which was the route his rat minions were going to use to infiltrate the castle. Sate then heard Goldo's voice on a communicator which he had given to him earlier. He informed Sate that they all had arrived at Wyvern's hiding spot. He then inquired about how Sate was faring. He replied by saying that he was unaware that there were barriers on the windows, but it still wasn't something that he couldn't handle. Goldo mentioned to Sate that it was just as he predicted. All the commoners in the kingdom had been brainwashed and walked around the city like a bunch of mindless zombies. Such a large-scale manipulation had reminded Late just how strong Sadarks was. He also wondered why he never did anything with his power. Until now, Sate then suggested that maybe he had to wait for a specific time. Just then, the king had an idea on why Sadarks had to wait for so long before launching his attack, but he decided to let it go in hope that he was just overthinking it. He then reminded Sate about what he had requested for while they were still in the wilderness, which was to protect Prince Cassus if he were to find him. Sate acknowledged this and was aware that the king was counting on him. We observe some servants being granted permission to enter the king's bedroom, where we see Sadarks seated on the throne, and the servant referring to him as acting King Sadarks. Sate felt that this was his chance to advance, so he moved his magic tool towards the bedroom door, but suddenly, he observed that was alert magic all over the door which would have notified them all that a foreign being had entered the room. Sate then decided to snipe, but realized that he wasn't in his field of view. He was surprised at the fact that the room was more assassination-proof than he expected. He then proceeded to eavesdrop on their conversation and overheard the servant mentioning that they had dispatched numerous missionaries to over 10 towns to promote religious conversions. The servant then mentioned that it was around 246 people were reported to have been spoken to about the religious conversions. However, Sadarks thought those numbers were quite low for his standard. Sate listened to whole conversation and understood that he was planning to change people's religions, but he was unaware of the reason behind it. He eavesdropped even more and heard that the missionaries they had sent were trying their very best, but it seemed like there was a big resistance when changing gods after believing in them for a long time. Sadarks remarked, saying the fact that mind control didn't work for religious conversions wasn't a good outcome, and told his servant to bust his ass and work even harder to prevent the downfall of the country. He also mentioned that they must rely on the god Lura's Mars Sama. Sate was surprised to hear that the goddess Mises and the evil god Masarazul weren't the only gods which existed in this world. Sadarks then reminded his servant on what to do to those who resist the religion conversions, which was to convince them with their fists and a whip. To accomplish that, they had formed an inquisition which would begin the next day. Sadarks approved of and gave his blessing. Sate understood that it was just an alias for a new religion, and it was similar to what goddess Mises had mentioned to him. Rather than convincing them, they extorted them through torture, so most of them wouldn't have a choice but to convert religions. Sate then asked Goldo whether he was aware of anything concerning Lura's Mars. He replied, saying that it was a new religion which had started in their country roughly 30 years ago. It was a faith with many practical benefits, which was why it had numerous believers. Sate then asked what he meant by benefits. Goldo then explained that people who believed in Lura's Mars would get free bread if they went to the church. Their faith appeared to be built upon the belief of charity to others. However, Goldo then mentioned that he was just curious about where they got the money from to supply the food. The general public still liked it regardless of the dark rumors which spread around about it. Sate then concluded that it was a religion which had its believers increasing rapidly through bribery, and the source of the money used for this bribery was unknown, which was hella suspicious. Goldo stated that was still, however, a belief in the goddess Mises in the country. Mostly dudes as old as Goldo, 30 years old, believed in the goddess Mises, while a lot of the youths believed in Lura's Mars. Goldo asked why he was asking about religion so suddenly. He then replied by saying that he was just being curious. Sate sensed a huge magic reaction, so he informed the others that their goose was cooked and their cover had been blown. Just then, an attack had been launched and was targeted at Princess Lumia, but Goldo had jumped in the way to block the blow. King Lias and Raisel then shouted in concern for them both. The people who unleashed the attack appeared to be 2 former members of the chivalric order, who easily recognized the Lias and were shocked to see him alive because he was rumored to have died from a disease. One of them remarked that the power which Sadarks had lent him felt astonishing. Their stealth was impeccable, so the king was surprised as to how they were able to figure out their location. Raisel took a step in front of the king and informed him that they were former members of the chivalric order, named Bada and Sting, and most likely were being manipulated. Bada observed that they were curious at how they had found them, and began to explain how their location had been exposed. He mentioned that it was as a result of Old Man Kroon's marking magic. Raisel then told them to shut the fuck up because he didn't see Kroon as the kind of person to join the enemy. Even if he were being manipulated, they would have easily known due to the distinctive cloudiness of their eyes. One of the former soldiers proceeded to call Raisel a dumbass, and the other one then mentioned that he was somehow aware that they had sold about 100 level 0 potions at a go. And now that he thought about it, it was rather surprising that they were able to return to the kingdom from that monster-infested wilderness in just a single night. He went on to ask who had helped them up to that point, but Lias replied saying it was a bed maker in the forests. He also went on to ask the former knights what they intended to achieve by siding with Sadarks to take over the country. He assumed that it was either money or power. They both screamed the word power and mentioned that they once were a bunch of weaklings, but only a strong king could give them true power. The power to be free, the power to dominate everything, the power to steal, in other words. The king of a country who had no remarkable power and could be easily overthrown didn't deserve to be protected. Their intentions were what Lias had always feared, the Mises kingdom to be reborn under the guidance of god Lura's Mars. Soon after, a mysterious sword emerged from the former knight's foot. Then we see Raisel charging at him. The king kicks a chair at the former knight's comrade, which got him stuck to the wall. Raisel then followed up the attack by slashing at the ex-knight while calling him a filthy traitor. Goldo arrived late at the scene with Lumia, where we saw the ex-knights appearing to be in critical condition and just on the brink of death. Lumia then ran to her father, and we experienced a rather touching and emotional moment which was quite rare in this manga. To their surprise, the two ex-knights still had some fight in them. They suspected that the sword was put through his foot through the use of substitution magic. Subsequently, they took a vow, which was to make everyone who had a relationship with the king suffer. Raisel and Goldo then urged the king to stand back, so they could show them both what the knights of the Mises kingdom were made of. A magic-dependent criminal ex-knight like Bada didn't scare Raisel, so he utilized his kingdom's royal sword art, Swarm of Flashing Stars, to launch an attack. Bada felt that Raisel was underestimating him, so he let him know that he had received magical powers from Sadarks and wasn't the same worthless insect he knew him as before. He said this while demonstrating a bit of his power, which surprised Liaz because Bada he knew was a huge weakling. He then attacked Raisel, but he managed to endure it, which impressed Bada. However, that was just the beginning. Sting then charged at Raisel, which took him by surprise. Then we witness a flashback where Goldo offered Late some food since he had skipped last night's dinner. Liaz then reminded Late that he had asked him to build something and also inquired about how it was coming along. Late said he was done with the item and had made one for everybody. He built a shoulder shield for Goldo which possessed defense magic. It complemented his fighting style by blocking the enemy's attack. Its defensive power was an equivalent of a movable barrier. Goldo then used his shield to block Sting's attack, while telling Raisel that they had gotten a lot stronger so he shouldn't let his guard down like that again. Sting was shocked to see that Goldo wasn't injured from taking such a blow, and was impressed by the strength of the shield. Bada then asked Sting to shut the fuck up and subsequently mentioned that Goldo's shield would be practically useless against his magic, and no matter how defensive all their equipment was, they would still have to avoid it, and then attack. Bada then launched a butterfly fragment attack at Liaz. However, the look on his face implied that he had a means to defend it. It turned out that before they had left for the mission, Late had gifted him with an improved directional barrier to be used for defense, so he informed his guards that they shouldn't worry about him anymore, cause he was now a big boy. Sting and Bada were shocked to see that Liaz was in possession of a directional barrier. He then informed them that it wasn't just any ordinary directional barrier, but a custom one. He then launched an attack on the ex-knights, which they managed to evade. However, they were surprised at his attack since they had never seen a directional barrier attack from the inside. This attack had made their formation uncoordinated, creating an opening for Raisel to counter. Sting attempted using his magic to stop Raisel's overhead slash, but to his surprise, Raisel passed through it and proceeded to land the overhead attack, which was the finishing blow. The weapon he used was a magic sword known as the Burning Ceremony, gifted to him by Late before the mission. It was crafted from a blazing tree, and it was proposed to be quite a mighty sword. However, it could only be used once, so he should only use it when necessary. He lifted it up and considered it to be a regular old stick, and all that burning ceremony stuff was pure bullshit. Before the mission, Late mentioned to him that it was a wooden sword which awakened the power inside the wielder when it was set on fire. But Raisel just didn't believe that setting that shit on fire wasn't going to make a difference. However, Raisel's blow didn't kill Sting, so moments later, he regained his strength and vowed to make Raisel regret not killing him. Just then, Bada asked him to shut the fuck up and realized that it was rather strange that their enemies were totally unfazed by their ambush. They didn't attempt to run away, and moreover, they were well prepared for their attack, and in that same moment, Bada sensed that Sadarks was in danger. Apparently, there was a massive explosion. The directional barrier which was guarding the kingdom had been destroyed. Liaz then wondered why such a heavy explosion had happened since Late was just meant to assassinate Sadarks quietly. Then unexpectedly, the ex-knights pointed out that they weren't going to check on Sadarks, because they felt that what they expected them to do. Bada went on to mention that mere beings like themselves didn't need to worry about someone as powerful as Master Sadarks. Meanwhile, Sadarks is seen sipping a cup of tea on his throne, while aware that there had been attacks launched on his kingdom. But unaware of who was behind them, however, one thing he knew for sure was that nobody was going to kill him so easily. Late analyzed the barrier and concluded that after an attack, it could only last about 2 seconds at best, so he proceeded to attack Sadarks once again. Just before it hit, Sadarks uttered a special protection incantation, which strengthened his barrier and blocked Late's assassin attempt and created a loud sound that echoed around the whole kingdom. After this occurrence, Late observed that Sadarks had utilized the power of a long incantation spell to strengthen his barrier. Meanwhile, when Liaz heard the nearly deafening sound, he wondered whether everything went as planned. The ex-knights smirked while mentioning that it was obvious that their master was much stronger than they expected, and the same went for them too. And just by looking at them, it was obvious that they possessed a different aura than before. Sting then used his nail machine gun technique to launch a flurry of attacks on them. Goldo then noticed that they were definitely stronger than a few moments ago. Sting then reminded him that he wasn't that same weakling he used to throw around like a sack of old potatoes. Goldo accepted that, but mentioned that Sting was still as careless as ever while landing a blow on the floor, which made Sting to lose his footing and made him realize that he was screwed. Raisel then rushed to Sting while he had lost his coordination to deliver a defining blow, when suddenly Lena appeared with a smirk on his horrendous face and told Raisel to stop ignoring him and give him some audience. Raisel charged at him, but Bada managed to counter with a magic attack. He then taunted Raisel by reminding him that he intended to beat him with his oh-so-royal swordsmanship. At that moment, Bada experienced a slight cut on his face, so he began to wonder whether Raisel was the one who had caused it. What concerned him even more was the fact that Raisel was able to hold out that long in the fight with a broken sword. Suddenly, Raisel proceeded to go Super Saiyan, and Bada noticed something different about his sword. At first, he thought it was a magic sword, but later realized that he was covering the sword with an ore. Raisel then stated that his feelings hadn't changed on the fact that there was nothing to fear about a trash knight who solely relied on magic. Raisel also mentioned that he would be going all out and wouldn't be showing any mercy. With the attack Bada had received, he noticed that Raisel had begun to see through his attack patterns, and was no longer a match for him. Bada arrogantly smirked and let off an attack which he was certain would put Raisel down. But just then, the king used his directional barrier to parry the attack. He then mentioned to Raisel that he had pushed too far forward, and also ordered them all to fall back and regroup since the enemy's strength had surpassed their expectations. But they still had a chance to win if they had Late's item, so he told them all to wait for it. Raisel coldly stepped forward and told Liaz in the nicest way possible to shut the fuck up, and playing it safe wasn't the best way to handle this situation. Raisel charged at him while saying that he wasn't going to soil the name of the Macy's kingdom anymore. Bada replied saying that he should be a good little boy and listen to Liaz. He then urged both Raisel and the king to look behind themselves. They observed a magic catastrophe plummeting towards Goldo, who was totally unaware of it. Liaz screamed his name, but he was too far away to hear his cry, so they both dashed in Goldo's direction. But Raisel had almost immediately overtaken Liaz all in an attempt to save Goldo. As Raisel was sprinting, he began to recall some of his recent failures, such as his mock fight against Late, and also when he didn't realize that a tracking spell had been placed on him. He further concluded that all he had done so far was fuck up in every opportunity that presented itself. He then began to question what all his training had been for. Okay, now this is getting sad. He felt that this was finally his moment to be someone's savior, so he finally reached Goldo and jumped in front of him, which made him receive the damage from the attack. This event left him with a hole in his heart. Literally. Flashback to the night before their departure at Late's house. While they were cross-checking the equipment they would use to carry out the operation, Late had discovered a strange object that was planted under Raisel's arm. It was a magic tracker, and it had been there the entire time, so it was obvious that their location had been exposed. Raisel apologized for allowing such to happen, and immediately attempted to use his other hand to remove it, when suddenly Liaz had an idea, which was to leave the tracker under his arm. He suspected that Sadarks would send Bada and Sting to hinder their assassination mission, so he gave Raisel an order, which was to sneak into the royal capital with the tracker on whenever Late was ready. They were going to act as bait to lure Bada and Sting away from the assassination site. Goldo and Raisel then mentioned that it was too dangerous of a mission for a king to go on. Liaz replied saying that someone who was fit to be a king couldn't be sacrificing the asses of others just to save his own, he said while standing in a very corny pose. He also informed Lumia that she was to stay behind with Goldo, but she disagreed. He then asked her to stop being a dumbass and also let her know just how dangerous this mission was going to be. She replied saying that it being dangerous was more reason why she should go, considering that she didn't want to be known as a weak and worthless princess if they were to take the kingdom back. The king and princess then glared at each other with cold eyes. After a while, the king had finally given up and decided to let her come along. However, he mentioned to Goldo that if things started to go south, he should take Lumia and get the hell out of there. Back to the present day, Raisel was lying on the ground and was smoked, literally, while Liaz and Goldo were fighting. Lumia and her pet began to pour some level 2 potions in an attempt to heal him. However, his weak body wasn't responding. With a weak voice, Raisel urged the princess to escape while she still could. He then hoped that Late would somehow be able to handle the rest. While on the brink of death, Raisel continued to beat himself up by saying that he had once more degraded the name of the Macy's kingdom. But Princess Lumia didn't care about that shit anymore and just told him to rest. Just then, Bada slowly walked in on them, telling Raisel to adhere to his princess's instructions because any struggling which he did at this point would be meaningless, and on hearing Bada's voice, Lumia immediately turned her head in fright. Liaz and Goldo observed Lumia's situation and immediately ran to her rescue. Meanwhile, Bada mentioned to Raisel that although they used to be classmates, he wondered how they both ended up so differently. He then offered Raisel his hand, saying that if he accepted Sadark's power, he would be able to manifest a power which was multiple times stronger than his. His persuasion went as far as him saying that he should leave the king and princess, that they were only dragging him down and preventing him from reaching his full potential. Meanwhile, Late was still trying to disrupt Sadark's barrier, but it was to no avail because Sadark's had made use of long chanting magic. It was so challenging to learn that just over 5 letters would take an outstanding magician to master, so he concluded that Sadark's was on a whole other level. Late's next course of action was to attack using his third assassination tool, which was a specially made dreadnought magic missile. It was so heavy that it couldn't ascend without the aid of boosters because it had a large quantity of magic explosives, and even a magic barrier which used a 10-word chant, it still wouldn't be able to defend, so Sadark's was basically screwed. As the missiles were on their way, Sadark sensed the strength of the incoming attack, and knew that he had to step up his barrier's defense. He then secreted some kind of magic fluid from his mouth, and began utter his chant. And this time, it consisted of 12 words. The missiles hit, and his barrier still managed to defend it. Late was baffled at how he was able to perform such long chants, because even the strongest magician in VLO wouldn't be to use such a long chant. In the midst of all this, Late still had a smirk on his face, and came to the realization that he would have to make use of his last resort. In the interim, just as we thought Raisel was going to accept Bada's deal, he gave off a sign, indicating that he was not going to accept. He then reminded Bada that he was an imperial knight, and he was ready to devote his future, as well as his power, to the royal family. Bada was disappointed on hearing Raisel's statement, and proceeded to say that he was no different from ordinary puppets, and he would soon become the foundations of their greatness. Lumia was pissed off at the fact that Bada had referred to the citizens he had brainwashed as mere puppets. Raisel attempted to get up and save the princess because he sensed danger, but he immediately fell onto the ground face first. With a very serious face, Lumia asked Bada what he stood to gain from abusing the citizens like that. The next thing we see is Bada smacking Lumia across the face. However, this wasn't what he had intended to do. He actually intended to kill her at that moment. But for some reason, he held back on the moment their eyes crossed each other. He also mentioned that her tint body appeared to be huge in his eyes. Lumia clenched her fist, and suddenly, Goldo and Liaz got smacked into a wall by Sting, which made Lumia scream in concern of her father. Goldo then told the king and the princess to get behind him because he sensed a significant amount of magic coming from Sting. Sting then walked in with an aura which was very different from before and asked Bada what was the hold-up with killing them. Bada apologized, saying that he had just lost his composure, and at that moment, a dark being emerged from Sting's body, recalled that he mentioned that he had lost his composure, and then questioned Bada on whether his faith towards Lura's Mars was staggering or not. Bada recognized the voice of this being to be Sadark's and attempted to explain the situation, but he was asked to shut the fuck up. Sadark's went on to call both Sting and Bada the utter worthless and useless trash of the old Macy's kingdom, for losing composure when fighting an old associate. Just then, his dark magic struck both of them, which was intended to burn their lives and turn them into attack magic. At least they would finally be useful that way. The sacrifice of both their lives yielded a type of hybrid magic called Spiral Requiem. However, Sadark's wasn't pleased by this and stated how useless they both were, since they had sacrificed their lives just to yield such weak magic. The huge Spiral Requiem was then launched at them, but Goldo managed to defend it. He then asked the king to run away, as he couldn't defend the attack for much longer. Liaz replied by telling not to be a fool because he obviously wasn't going to run away in a critical time like this. Goldo didn't like the sound of it, but he didn't have a choice but to agree. Liaz then told Lumia to take Raisel and flee from the battlefield, but like father like daughter, she proved stubborn and insisted on staying. At this point, Goldo had accepted that his goose was cooked and began to give his thanks to Liaz like a sick person lying on their deathbed. But the Liaz urged him not to be so quick to give up. He was also disgusted by the way Sadark's Gad treated his subordinates, and if things went on like that, there would be no saving him, as his life would burn out as fuel for magic eventually, but they would have been dog food by the time that happened. Leah's only hope that they could deliver a heavy attack. That way, the playing field would be leveled. And at that same moment, Raisel somehow mustered some strength and got to his feet while holding his burning ceremony sword, all with a dead look in his eyes. Leah's told him not to be a fool and try anything reckless since his wounds had just healed. Raisel replied by saying that he was the one who had put them in this situation, so he should allow him to resolve it, even if it would cost him his life, and also vowed not to die until the enemy had been defeated. His last resort was to believe what Late had told him about the burning ceremony stick being super powerful. Raisel then screamed the words "burning ceremony," and immediately he uttered those words, there was a huge fiery explosion which left everyone watching with a dropped jaw. That puny stick which Raisel had held earlier had now transformed into a huge flaming sword, and different techniques and traits of the sword began to appear in his head. This sword had boosted his confidence, which made him believe that he could actually win this battle. Leah said he was going to protect Lumia, so Goldo and Raisel should focus on the main target. With that dead look in Raisel's eyes, he knew it was time to end it, so he leaped up towards the enemy and utilized Amici's Kingdom Imperial sword art which was called Glittering Binary Star. Sadarks had used Sting as a vessel for his attack, so Raisel's recent attack didn't affect Sadarks, but only Sting. After that, there was a huge hole in the sky from which bright light was being emitted. Goldo then wondered whether this erotic battle had finally ended. Leah's remarked that Raisel's magic tool was so strong that it managed to pierce the clouds, and Lumia wondered how things were going on Late's end. Suddenly, Raisel yelled, telling the princess to look behind her, and before she could make a full 180-degree turn, one of the brainwashed commoners had stabbed Lumia right between her watermelons. But it was rather strange because she wasn't in any pain whatsoever. She just stood there looking at the knife sticking out of her chest, which left everyone perplexed. Suddenly, a shot which came from inside her bust had hit the mindless commoner. It appeared to be a magic gun tool, which was being controlled by a magic being Late had built. However, Lumia was still shocked at the realization that she had just killed a man, with the initial attack area being her bust. Moments later, Goldo and Leah swarmed her and inquired about how she was feeling and whether she was hurt in any way. She replied saying that she wasn't hurt, and it was all thanks to the magic being. Apparently, the magic tool being wedged between her watermelons had prevented the blade from penetrating her flesh. Subsequently, Raisel's blade capacity had been exhausted, and he suddenly just realized how lucky he was to have had it, because assuming he didn't, they all would have been dog food by now, so he gave Late his thanks for all he had helped them with. Goldo then proposed that they gotta move on. To avoid incoming crowds, Leah's agreed to this, and then they departed. Just mere seconds after they started to move, a gigantic beam of light was observed behind them, and it appeared to be coming from the royal palace. Going a little back in time, Late and Sadarks were having a little back and forth among themselves. Sadarks was pissed off at how much of a pain in the ass his opponent was being, so he demanded that his enemy reveal his identity. However, Late replied saying that it was just a little too early for them to meet. Sadarks, he had a duty of fulfilling the great Master Azul's grand wish, so he didn't have the time to waste on a proposed loser like Late. One thing Late noticed was that when Sadarks spoke about a god earlier, he mentioned the name of Master Azul instead of Lura's Mars. This implied that Sadarks was aware of his real name. There was a massive explosion, so Sadarks assumed that Sting and Bada's hybrid magic had activated. However, the strength of the magic wasn't that significant, but it was still also quite effective. Sadarks then assumed that they would have managed to have defeated Leah's at that point, so all he had to do was to get rid of the one who had aided King Leah's and everything would finally be complete. Even before he was able to complete his last sentence, he observed a massive hole in the sky, and was also unable to sense Bada and Sting's magic presence anymore while saying what the hell is going on here. And just then, Late began to launch yet another attack. Sadarks assumed it would be just like one of his previous attacks and would easily be able to defend it. But before he knew it, his fingers began to decay as a result of a soul spell which Late had cast. This was Late's trump card. It was the strongest and most effective assassination spell used to kill literally any kind of magician. It was known as Soul Destruction. And as Sadarks' body degraded, he continued to utter some chants and attempt to save himself, but all his efforts would be futile because this was a spell which was cast by resonating a significant amount of magic stones, thereby creating a special magical wavelength which would destroy any soul. So no matter how strong his magic barrier was, he couldn't shield himself from it, and no matter how strong the magician was, they were unable to enhance their soul, which was the source of their life, for there was no spell which could protect a person's soul. But despite all these facts, Sadarks refused to accept that he was screwed and still continued to chant. After the soul destruction had been fully activated, Sadarks wasn't dead, but rather seen on his knees with some missing body parts. With the observation of Sadarks' missing limbs and also the foreign magic that surrounded him, Late then understood what Sadarks was chanting wasn't a mere spell. Rather, it was a ritual which he had used to protect his soul from its destruction. He had offered Master Azul his eyes and arms in exchange for the protection of his soul. This spell which Starks had made use of was one which Late wasn't familiar with in VLO, simply because it didn't exist, and more something even greater than an ordinary spell. There was a huge gust of wind and Sadarks had emerged with missing eyes and body limbs. At the same time, King Leas and the others were seen to be getting chased by the brainwashed citizens, so they ran for their dear lives until they arrived at a dead end. Just when they felt that all hope was lost, the mind manipulation magic had been dispelled from their bodies. Lumia then wondered whether this could be Late's doing. However, they couldn't be so certain yet. Subsequently, they all witnessed some kind of magic beings returning to a focus point in the sky from all the bodies of the formerly brainwashed citizens. Assuming he gave a bit of magic to his citizens so that he could control them, that giant thing in the sky would be an accumulation of his magic. Late stood at a distance and observed how strong Sadark's magic had gotten. This had surpassed the level of an ordinary magician, and was now assumed to be godlike. That gigantic ball of magic was a highly concentrated mass of magic. It was so deadly that one could neither dodge its blows nor defend itself from it. Being aware of all that, Late still had the confidence that he was going to slaughter it. He considered the speed of the mass of magic, the distance between them both, his leftover weapons arsenal, and the amount of magic he still had left. He used all this information to deduce that it would take exactly 1 minute to decide a winner. He then told Sadarks to bring it on and proceeded to begin his attack by activating his secret weapon. At the same time, Sadarks felt that this opponent of his, whoever he is, was going to be a massive threat to Master Azul. Sadarks used a technique called Triple Monkey Golem to create 3 gigantic magic henchmen in attempt to subdue Late. There was chaos with lightning and thunder everywhere. They charged at each other with everything they had because they both knew that this was the match-defining blow. Seconds later, there was a gigantic explosion, and with less than a second left on the clock, Late stood victorious and marked the mission as complete, with a sharp needle in his hands. Late then contacted the rest of the team to inform that Sadarks had been assassinated. They all expressed their joy on hearing this, and Leas expressed his gratitude, while mentioning that he was definitely going to repay him for the success of this mission. He also informed Late that he was going to handle everything else, so he should leave the rest to him. In hindsight, Late had expected this to be an easy job. However, to stumble upon such a challenging opponent after just 6 days of being transported into the world was a surprising feat for him. The tool which Late had used to Sadarks was an extremely thin needle that wasn't even up to 0.2 millimeters wide. But there was a bit of a twist. It was covered with the strongest and most ferocious poison which could not be dispelled no matter hard you try. Sadarks had been focused on the flashy attacks Late was making. He was so distracted that Late managed to strike him with the poison needle. As per his original plan, he went on to say that although Sadarks had become over 1,000 times stronger than he initially was, he was still dog water. Late had been put through so much trouble ever since he had accepted Goddess Maisa's request to slay Master Azul, and Sadarks, who was his first assassination target since he came to this new world, was hella strong. He had the capability to cast incantations that were more than a dozen words long. Plus, Late had never seen a magician who was able to withstand a soul spell, and furthermore, he was aware that if Sadarks had somehow managed to dodge the poison needle, that would have been end for him. All that being said, if it weren't for Goddess Maisa's request, he never would have been able to witness such a fun assassination mission, so he was grateful that she had launched his ass into such an interesting isekai. A couple of days later, we see Raisel and Late staring very awkwardly at each other. However, their main reason for meeting was for Raisel to extend his thanks to Late for all he had done. He mentioned that the royal family would compensate him accordingly for his assassination, and they had deemed the assassination as officially complete. Raisel had a little extra gratitude to express to Late and went on to bow while apologizing for all the disrespect he had shown to him throughout their time together, and also thanked him for all he had done for him. Late was surprised by Raisel's action. Who he knew to be a very bitter and petty dude, had turned a new leaf. Just before Raisel departed, Late had gifted him a new sword. He uncased it, and it turned out to be his old sword. Raisel wondered how this was even possible because he watched his sword get destroyed before his very eyes. Late then explained that it Lumia's magic pet, Maki, who had picked up a piece of the material of it when it was destroyed. So Late just analyzed the material, making it easier for him to craft a new one for him, so he should basically be thanking Mackie for this. On hearing this, Rachel blushed a bit while thanking him for it. Let's just hope he isn't gay now. Also, Late gifted them all with comfy mattresses, since it was something they were used to. Rachel then dragged the cart filled with the mattresses back to the royal palace. Subsequently, Late already had an idea to completely assassinate the evil god Master Azul. He still had some time, so he wanted to spend some of it working on his equipment, but he decided to start things off by slowly putting his plans into action.